This afternoon, to commemorate the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we welcome Dr. Paul Bermanzohn, who will present a program entitled King Was a Revolutionary as part of the African Roots Center Real History series. By discussing two of King's best-known speeches, I Have a Dream and Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, Paul will show how King sought to build a new society free of discrimination, oppression, and exploitation. The child of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, Paul has been a lifelong political activist. In high school and college, he was active in the movement against the Vietnam War. In Duke Medical School, he helped build a local chapter of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which supported the ideal that healthcare is a human right. He was the first graduate of Duke's environmental medicine program. Now retired, Paul practiced psychiatry for almost 4 decades, also serving as a professor at Einstein Medical School and medical director of the Dutchess County Assertive Community Treatment Team during the last 5 years of his career. Paul was a leader in the November 3rd, 1979 anti-Klan march in Greensboro, North Carolina. He was shot in the head by a KKK and Nazi death squad, which had been organized and led by the police. 5 people were killed that day, and of the 10 people wounded, he was the most seriously injured. He later helped to organize the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated these events 25 years later. This was the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission held in North America. Since retiring, Paul discovered he was a historian trapped in the body of a psychiatrist. He works on his transition by studying the history of the United States propaganda system. He lives in the Hudson Valley with his wife of 44 years, Sally, a historical novelist. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Paul Bermanzohn.
Thank you. I just want to begin by saying that a truly balanced program, I think, would include music, and you don't want me to provide any kind of music. So all it'll be is a talk that I'll be giving. I can imagine that a program of this kind commemorating Dr. King could benefit from a performance by Nina Simone. I think that would be ideal for such a thing, but alas, it didn't happen. So what I want to talk about is a little about what's going on today and more reflecting on Dr. King and his significance for us. The global pandemic has sharply revealed the vast inequalities of US society, making it clearer than ever that we need a fundamental reordering of US and global society. At the same time, we may be facing an ongoing fascist rebellion, one which is directed at preventing precisely such a reordering of society. Now, although media representations make him look like a moderate, middle-of-the-roader, Martin Luther King worked for a fundamental change. He sought to build a new world, a beloved community based on respect and trust among people. King was a nonviolent revolutionary. Revolution doesn't have to mean violent change. We shouldn't just celebrate King's legacy on his birthday. On just his birthday. That's like saying Black history should only be discussed in February. Both need to be studied year-round. King's life and work are a guide to how to resist this evil system. King has been my lifelong hero, a major influence on me. I've tried hard to understand King's meaning for us as people trying to change the world. One thing he said had a big impact on me. If you've got nothing worth dying for, you've got nothing worth living for. That's worth pondering. So please bear with me as I try to present a different view of King from the one that's usually presented at memorials for him. a view that's very different from the nonsense we're constantly fed by the media. King was a revolutionary. King's birthday is usually celebrated as a way to cover this up. He's presented as a beloved, inspiring, and safe icon who was not a threat. But while he was loved by the people, he was feared and hated by the rulers. I want to contrast the speech we're usually reminded about each year, his eloquent "I Have a Dream" speech of August 28, 1963, with another important speech, Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, which he gave on April 4th, 1967, only 4 years later. 1 year after his Vietnam speech, 1 year to the day after his Vietnam speech, he was assassinated in Tennessee, supporting the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. The fact that he was killed on the anniversary of the Vietnam speech should be taken as a warning for people to stay away from the revolutionary Dr. King. That's his real legacy. King was and is dangerous to the established order. King's murder a year later on the exact day of his Vietnam speech is a clear statement in the universal language of assassinations. In his Vietnam speech, King called out the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. Now, these are the foundation of the American system. He said we need to get on the right side of the world revolution. We need a revolution of values to turn the country around. Most important, he said, the US government was the main purveyor of violence in the world. The US was spreading death and destruction, not democracy, when it invaded Vietnam. That's still true today. The system wants us to remember King's great dream speech as a safe speech, one that doesn't call for fundamental transformation of US society. But the "I Have a Dream" speech was a step towards King becoming a revolutionary, a long march King was on. That's why the system doesn't want us to understand what he was saying and doing. The system doesn't want us to join him on that march. Let's look more closely at King's life. In 1952, when he first started going out with Coretta, Martin wrote to her saying, "Today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. It has brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes." That's a direct quote. He told her, "I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic," another quote. In 1955, now married to Coretta for 2 years, the couple moved to Alabama, where he led the Montgomery bus boycott. After their stunning victory in Montgomery, very few places in the United States invited King to speak. He was an outcast looking to find his way forward. Earlier in the year of the March on Washington, in early 1963, King helped lead the Birmingham campaign, where police attacked peaceful demonstrators with clubs, dogs, and water cannons. We've all seen video of that. King went to jail in Birmingham. In his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, he exposed white liberals for doing nothing, just criticizing from the sidelines. He said, "The Negro's great stumbling block in this stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection," King said in that letter. A short time later, on August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people, about 2/3 Black and 1/3 white, came together to Washington in a massive show of unity and peace. It marked a high tide in the civil rights movement. Before it, King was attacked by the nation's press because the idea of so many organized poor people coming to the nation's capital horrified the rulers. The nation's newspapers predicted violence in the streets and denounced King in advance of the march. The march happened without any violence. King's "I Have a Dream" speech was a call to freedom and enfranchisement for a people who had endured centuries of slavery and then re-enslavement, enforced by segregation and lynch mob rule. King reminded us that the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. Further on, he says, the marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to distrust all white people, for many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny and their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. He continued promoting militancy. We can never be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. He concluded his speech with a memorable vision, his dream. When we allow freedom to ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. These are moving words, but what is he saying? His dream was a vision of a national rising for justice and freedom for all. King was starting to talk about a revolution. And to do it, he was developing a new, specifically American vocabulary, discarding the leaden language of the official left. Actually, it's an old vocabulary, that of the African-American church, probably the most American vocabulary of all. The I Have a Dream speech was not a moderate or middle-of-the-road speech at all. I believe its radical content is a big reason for its enduring popularity. But the rulers and their media want us to remember it only as a benign, non-confrontational fantasy, a dream. The first speech, which still moves me, was a big step on King's road to becoming a revolutionary. He and his closest colleagues, particularly Vincent Harding, intensified their efforts to make revolution in the United States. Right after the March on Washington, they launched the Poor People's Campaign to mobilize millions to end poverty in the US. King was always seeking ways to confront real official power with organized, real people power. He always sought to mobilize the wretched of the earth to take power, not with violence, but with their and our moral power, our soul force. They were working to develop a people's campaign for a new society. King was seeking to create a people's movement to end poverty, not just leave it to the US government. For the US government, a war on poverty has always been a war waged on poor people. The US government will not make a revolution for us. After his 1963 speech, King redoubled his efforts for civil rights. He led campaigns in St. Augustine, Florida, and Selma, Alabama. But he also went on to lay the groundwork for a Poor People's Campaign. It's amazing to me how much you can do when you're young. He was just 34. Today, one of the best ways to memorialize King is to join with the new Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. In 1964, King got the Nobel Peace Prize. He was increasingly recognized as the moral leader in the United States. Working on the Poor People's Campaign, he realized there was no way to solve America's problems without ending the war in Vietnam. A slaughter was going on there, and it was wasting precious resources. King's Poor People's Campaign was a bold plan. The campaign was going to bring busloads of people, maybe millions, to occupy Washington, D.C., demanding that Congress prioritize a massive anti-poverty package that included, among other things, a commitment to full employment, a guaranteed annual income, and more low-income housing, all things we still need. And it would have been, and they wanted to pay for it by ending the war in Vietnam, and it would have been resolutely nonviolent, like everything else he did. So on April 4th, 1967, he gave his fateful speech opposing the war in Vietnam. It was the first time he openly opposed the war. It was the speech of a mature revolutionary. He called for the US to get on the right side of the world revolution. He said we needed to build a new society, one that was people-oriented, not thing-oriented. His speech was given in Riverside Church. There weren't as many people there as there were at the 1963 March on Washington. Only 3,000 people directly heard that 1967 speech, but it was very influential. To really understand the impact of the speech, we should understand what was happening, what was going on when he gave it. As the civil rights movement in the South gained steam, African-American people in the North and people of all races were outraged by the treatment given to peaceful civil rights protesters. Many of the African-Americans in the North had come from the South only recently, just a generation or two before. In 1964, there began in Harlem a series of mass uprisings that the media still calls riots. These were mass revolutionary rebellions of people who had been subjected to racist oppression by the police in northern ghettos. This revolutionary upheaval, this great rebellion, went on in American cities every summer for years. An expression was coined in the US to describe this. People talked about a long, hot summer. Over 300 cities were affected by uprisings like this over 4 years of upheaval. In 1967, a clueless Lyndon Johnson established the Kerner Commission to figure out why people were rebelling. In this context, King's call for revolution was especially courageous and bold. Its impact was enormous. The uprisings could not be contained by ordinary means. So Nixon viciously repressed all Black people by creating a phony drug war. His 1968 campaign of law and order was a promise to crush the revolutionary ghetto rebellions. He declared the drug war in 1979, and we're still suffering from the effects of that decision. Mass incarceration has continued to stalk the nation like a political zombie that won't rest, devouring the lives of millions. King's Vietnam speech had an immediate, immense impact on the anti-war movement. 11 days after the Riverside Church speech, on April 15th, 1967, King led an anti-war march on the United Nations. Over 400,000 people were there. No one had ever seen anything like it. The turnout was the result of King's speech before a small audience in Riverside Church. King's moral leadership was that powerful. It was the first demonstration I ever went to, my first political experience, and it left an indelible mark on me. More important, it changed the anti-war movement, making it possible for the American people to help end that war. Of course, the main reason the war ended was the great struggle of the Vietnamese people, who defeated the US military machine despite their lack of technology for waging war. The spirit of the Vietnamese people defeated the US. By opposing the war, we in America took a giant step towards getting on the right side of the world revolution, and King led this. The anti-war movement took a great leap forward. Before King's 1967 speech, the Riverside speech, 20,000 people at an anti-war event was considered a big success. After his speech, millions took to the streets to oppose the war. The anti-war movement operated on the idea that Vietnamese lives matter. It helped break with American exceptionalism, which believes that only white Americans count. Again, I'll say, when Nixon in 1971 declared the war on drugs and started mass incarceration, he did this to break the back of a growing revolutionary movement. The best evidence for this is not only its effect, but also what his co-conspirators said. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's top domestic advisor, shortly before he died in 1999, spoke to Harper's Magazine. Ehrlichman described Nixon's war this way to Harper's reporter Dan Baum. Baum recalls, "At the time I was writing a book about the politics of drug prohibition. I started to ask Ehrlichman a series of earnest, wonky questions that he impatiently waved away. You want to know what this was really all about? He asked with the bluntness of a man who, after public disgrace and a stretch in federal prison, had little left to protect. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that," said Ehrlichman, "had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs?" This is Ehrlichman still talking. He says, "Of course we did." Now, courts of law consider deathbed confessions as definitive evidence. This statement by Ehrlichman is close to a deathbed confession. He said it not long before he died, after he had served an 18-month prison sentence for his role in Watergate. He had nothing to lose or to gain. Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, quoted President Nixon as saying pretty much the same thing in his memoirs. Today, as a global pandemic is sweeping the nation and the economy is in free fall, things are worse than ever. And it's more and more becoming clearer than ever. But let's not fall into the trap of believing that getting back to normal would be a big deal. Before the pandemic and the pandemic-related economic collapse, the US was already a mess. Wars were and still are going on in over 5 countries. Things before the pandemic were awful. In May 2019, well before COVID-19, the Federal Reserve reported that 40% of all American families could not cover a $400 emergency. Everybody is on the edge of catastrophe. Americans' spiritual sickness had never been more severe. An opioid epidemic was already going on because so many people had lost the will to live. Thousands of people were being killed in violent, random gun attacks by people who snapped in this world's greatest country. Mass shootings had become a daily occurrence. They were so common that the media hardly even reported them anymore. And pornography was and is everywhere. The pandemic has killed lots more people in the US than the Vietnam War. The total of COVID-19 fatalities is fast approaching 400,000 dead in this country alone. In the 60s, Bobby Kennedy was upset that 300 soldiers were dying in Vietnam each week. The total US dead in Vietnam was 57,000. Vietnamese dead numbered over 3 million in a country of 40 million people. Almost 10% of the population was killed by the US invaders. And today, millions of Black and brown and poor white people are incarcerated and deprived of their most basic rights in this ideal democracy because of the phony drug war, which has always been an excuse for oppressing Black people and poor people to prevent rebellion. There's never been a greater need for fundamental transformation of our society than today. The crises we face today make revolution a necessity. And we have a lot to learn from King, how to think about, how to talk about, and how to organize and build for a revolution in our part of the world. That's why we should celebrate King's life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent.
Thank you.
I would invite people to put any questions they have into the chat, and I will be reading them so that Paul can answer them.
How about Paul can respond to them? Answer it, that's a high bar.
Okay, Paul can respond to them. While we're waiting for some comments, are there any extraneous comments that you would like to add, Paul?
It's just that things are so out of control now. It's such a bad situation in the United States. It was unimaginable in the 60s that things would be this unhinged. That's just a sort of general reflection on the whole situation.
Okay. Would people be more comfortable, let's say, raising their hand to ask a question? And then could do so? Oh, here we have. What do you think the next step is, Paul?
I think it depends what path you're on and how you're walking. I think that there's a lot of need for people to continue to organize and speak out. And there's a million ways to do that. And a lot of people on this call, I know, because I saw names and faces coming on, are already taking steps. So the next step is whatever it is that you're doing, continue doing that and take great strength and inspiration from King. That's the message for today for me.
There are some questions in the chat. I'll get to you in a moment, please, Carolyn. Paul's words today are even more powerful than last year when I first heard them. Paul, do you have any other specific suggestions for us today?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking that the many different things that are happening could perhaps at some point begin to come together in the form of a kind of a beloved community alliance, bringing different groups together to undertake common activities. It's just an idea that's been kind of kicking around in my head. So I don't know. I've been repeatedly surprised by everything that's happening during the pandemic. I thought everything would be locked down and shut down, but actually it's more active than any time I've seen. So I don't have a grand plan at this point, but I think people should continue to organize and pursue justice in all the many ways that can be done.
Thank you. I'll let Carolyn ask her question and then go back to the questions that are in the chat.
Thank you. I want to say I really enjoyed the talk. And I do have strong feelings about the fact that we lost Dr. King. I think that that's something that really stalled the progress of this country. But I've recently listened to a man by the name of Yuval, that's Y-U-V-A-L, Noah Harari. And I wonder whether the speaker is aware of him, and if he is, what he thinks of his ideas.
I have never heard this name and know nothing about him.
You might enjoy it if you look them up on YouTube. Very
I
interesting.
will. I wrote it down. That's Yuval Noah Harari.
Right, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.
The next question is, do you ever feel like we're going backwards in progress?
All the time. I mean, we're involved in a struggle against an evil system, so blows are exchanged. You can't assume that you're going to be involved in a struggle and it's just going to be, always, there's a slogan that I hate, forward ever, backward never. You have to go backwards sometimes because you get hit. King's assassination was a major hit. I think it slowed things down for sure, but the movement has continued to surge forward. So I think progress continues to be made. My political views have changed. I no longer believe our victory is inevitable. I do think we have a lot of work to do to continue to move things forward. And that's how I can respond to that.
The next question, Paul, is could you speak further about the kind of revolution you think we need based on the foundation laid by Dr. King?
Well, that's a great question. That's a great question. And I think, first of all, the matter of nonviolence and, really having a dignified, disciplined soul force. I think that's the biggest thing, number one. If we want to talk about tactics, it was just actually the last couple of days I realized that the Poor People's Campaign was designed to occupy Washington, D.C. It hadn't occurred to me until I was going over my talk. And it's like, this is well before Occupy Wall Street. But it's really bringing people together to take back what rightfully belongs to them. Those kind of tactics, I think, are enduring and useful. So I think there's, the idea of how to make a revolution has occupied many people for many years trying to figure out what to do. So that's an ongoing discussion. I don't claim to have any definitive or simple answer for that, but it's a great question.
Next question, do you refer to revolution of the mind?
I do. I think, the biggest, some of the biggest things that hold us chained are not the physical chains. I think that we're all kind of trapped in a web of American exceptionalism to erase what's in front of our eyes with this and replace it with a fantasy of American greatness. I think this is a kind of an ongoing thing that is always part of the ideological struggle against people rebelling. And I think that, we have to free ourselves of these ideological shackles as part of the struggle to make changes that are necessary.
Thank you.
I should probably talk about that more.
No, go ahead.
No. I don't want to go into a rant right now because I think there's a lot of people that want to say something and ask something.
Okay, there was another question, but I just want to let people know who joined us while this was in progress that we have been recording this and it will be made available on the African Roots Center YouTube channel and sent out to the people who attended this, who signed up and registered for this event. The next question is, do you have any advice on how to pull local communities together?
Talk to people and get started, and then ask other people for help. Troy Ellen's shaking her head. That's a good sign because she knows about these things.
I think that is, rather than giving a very long-winded answer, it is about action and it is about building coalitions and collaborating with people, all the people in the community. I mean, not me personally with all the people, but making sure that it's a good cross-section. Another question is, are you thinking much about disinformation supercharged by the right-wing media ecosystem? How do we counter it effectively?
I think about that stuff all the time, all the time. I wouldn't limit it to the right-wing media. I would also say that the liberal media is doing a lot of disinformation, particularly this American exceptionalism thing I'm talking about. People on the liberal side of the spectrum really, well, people on the right had this thing about make America great again, as if America had been great at some point. People on the liberal end of the spectrum, whipped up by the liberal media, have been really taking the view to dump Trump will make America great again. I think what we need to think about is what America has been in fact and how we need to change it. So I think there's a lot of this supercharged, as you said, disinformation being whipped around. And I think it's very difficult to keep orientation. If you're organizing with other people, that's the best way to maintain a clear orientation, because you talk to folks and you're building something concrete, so it's not often someplace else. So yes, thank you for that.
If anyone has any more questions, they could type into the chat.
Or comments.
Or comments, yes. Carolyn, can you type into the chat? Okay, hold on a moment, please.
I'll unmute.
I couldn't hear you. Please repeat it.
I wasn't able to, I typed it, but I wasn't able to send it. So what I'm hearing a lot is about the need for education, real education on real issues, because all these changes are really going to be in the hands of a much younger generation than mine. And that's the thing that concerns me very, very much. And unfortunately, COVID has really, you know, here in Kingston, we've had some, on Juneteenth celebrations, we've had some wonderful ways to bring the entire community together. Now we have COVID and that's kind of stopped. But I think about reading groups. And I think about book clubs, and I don't know whether anybody else in the audience has any thoughts on that, but, and I'd like to know, you know, whether anybody would like to work with me to get something like that started, especially for young people. Because actually there's a lot of wonderful movies and that sort of thing that are starting to help. There is movement in the right direction. It's just not enough, but we have to applaud it and support it and bring it to other people, bring it to the attention, like help young people understand what it means.
I would recommend Kingston Reads. If you can Google it, it's being hosted by Rough Draft Bar and Books. I believe it's starting in late February, mid to late February, and that it is race and social class is either the title or the topic. I'm not sure, but you can find more information about it online.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, I'd like to draw people's attention to the African Roots Library, which has been doing precisely what you're talking about.
Right.
For several years, and in spite of COVID has managed to continue holding programs like this one. And I think a key person in all of that is Troy Ellen, who has really been a backbone for this entire operation. So I would recommend that people, if you have the resources, make donations to the African Roots Center, because it's doing the necessary work. It's a great institution in Kingston. I'm proud to be associated with it.
And there are other organizations as well. Thank you very much, Paul. But Citizens Action of New York has been doing a lot of programming. Wednesday walks for Black Lives are mostly doing their walks live, but they share a great deal of information around that. Rise Up Kingston has programs oftentimes Facebook Live. A good resource to find out about these programs would be going to the Radio Kingston website and checking out their events page, because they're enormously supportive of the community and they disseminate a great deal of information about it. So a lot of this is going on already. Because I'm working with African Roots and also working with the Kingston Emergency Food Collaborative, I get the information organically. But if you start looking for it and clicking on things, you'll probably get way more emails than you ever thought you wanted, but you will get the information. We do have some more questions, which is, do you think legalizing drugs might be a helpful direction?
Anything that interferes with mass incarceration, I'm for it. And, you know, I know a lot of people who have spent unconscionable amounts of time in prison for doing nothing that harmed anybody else. I mean, getting high is not a crime. So right away there, I think there are a lot of thorny problems about some of the more addictive drugs than marijuana. But I think that if you decriminalize them, at least that's a good thing and a step in the right direction to diminish the amount of incarceration that has been going on in this country.
Next question is, could you recommend one or two of Dr. King's speeches or writings for us to read as a starting point for better understanding his message as a revolutionary?
A writer, I haven't read enough myself. I've read a few things and I've kind of put it together with my own life experience, but a writer I want to read more of, I've only begun to read, is Vincent Harding. Vincent Harding was the main author of the Vietnam speech, along with King, of course. But Vincent Harding was a great revolutionary himself who was devoted to training and elevating young revolutionaries. And he's a wonderful writer and a brilliant man, a very shrewd observer of the scene. So I would not only look into Dr. King, he wrote like 5 or 6 books. I would look into Vincent Harding as well. I think that he's really got a lot to say. And again, the way they talk about things is so much better than the official left.
Okay, I'm just scrolling down. I'm going to, where is it? It's a comment. I am frustrated by feeling I am still sitting on the sidelines. We have a very vibrant anti-racist group at the UU congregation in Kingston. We read, we watch, we talk, we participate in Kingston Reads, but not feeling we are making any difference except to ourselves. Not that learning our own racism is not so important. Who can we engage with as co-conspirators? Rise Up Kingston? I'll say that I think Rise Up would be a good start. I would also talk about Citizens Action and also reaching out to Rashida Tyler, Real Kingston Tenants Unit, Real Kingston Tenants Union, sorry. And then Ann Ames, who is one of the organizers of the Wednesday Walk for Black Lives and a member of Engine. And speaking of Engine, and Engine Kingston and the new Jim Crow Action Network. And if you need, the person I'm speaking to knows who I'm speaking to. And if you need any contact information, please feel free to send me an email so that I can provide it, okay?
Yeah, and just to be clear, Engine is ENJAN.
Oh, sorry, I said it, but I didn't spell it right.
Action Network.
Right. Next, where does revolution differ from insurrection? I struggle here and there to find something other than a moral difference between why people would storm the Capitol and why people riot in Minneapolis. I would say that one is protecting least and lost, where one is defending a position of power, but I want to know what you think. Thanks.
I agree with that. I don't think the right wing is pursuing a revolution. I think they're pursuing counter-revolution
And racism.
and racism. And they're really, they're not revolutionaries. I think a lot of people may want to be. I mean, I've met a lot of people on the right over the years and talked to them at some depth. But I think that, an insurrection is a seizure of power. And that may or may not be necessary under circumstances that I can't predict. But I think that a revolution, to me, is a more encompassing movement to transform essentially the ownership of the wealth of society, and then transforming the attitudes and the self-protection that the ruling classes have put into place to defend that system of ownership. And that's a long-term cultural, social, political struggle. It's not a quick thing. I think a lot of people think a revolution is just an insurrection. It's like a quick fix. But that an insurrection at its best is just the beginning of a much more comprehensive process.
Not at all. Racism.
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about systems and policy change in order to have lasting effect. Are there specific systems change initiatives or policies that you would suggest that we consider to effect change both nationally, but especially local? For example, Cuomo's Measure 203, addressing policing and police accountability. Are there others?
Well, I think that the best thing that Bernie Sanders did was advocate a comprehensive program of policy changes that could really mobilize the majority of American people. Things like Medicare for all, the
Green New Deal.
Green New Deal, getting rid of student debt, stopping evictions, and so on. And these all have local consequences as well. And there's a lot about the local scene I do not know, because I have not been active in the movement in that way. But I was just hearing from Troy Ellen that there's national policies on what constitutes an emergency that opens the door to how people are supported by the government to be able to live. And there's a group working on that. I can't remember the name of the group, but it's a subgroup of the Kingston Emergency Food Collaborative.
Maybe.
Systems change.
Systems change subgroup, thank you.
Right.
Exactly
And
what was asked for.
but in any event, and I welcome anybody who is interested in volunteering in any of these working groups. We have, and then I'll go back to your program, Paul. We have 4 working groups: direct service, we have education, both of ourselves and the community, we have systems change, and we also have production and procurement. But you can go to KingstonEmergencyFood.com. You can fill in the volunteer form and indicate what your interest is, and someone from the collaborative could reach out to you.
Great.
Another question, you mentioned the beloved community movement. Can you say more about how you imagine that?
Well, it's everything I've been talking about. I mean, it's going on and it needs to be strengthened and raised up even more. I think the basic thing about the ideal of a beloved community is when we're talking about a desirable society, we should emphasize not only the economic aspects, which is when people speak of socialism, that's the way people think of it, is purely in economic terms, but really social and cultural matters, like certainly an end to racism, but beyond that, people treating one another with respect and dignity. And I think the beloved community is treating everyone else as we ourselves would like to be treated. I mean, it's simple. It's the oldest lesson that there is, but it's very difficult to achieve when you have a society stratified by class.
Exactly. The Undoing Racism Workshop co-founder, David Billingsley, has a Zoom book read of his latest book, Deep Denial, listed in the Black History Month Kingston, February 11th, or the person has dropped the link in here. Then also, I'm going to put in the link to the Kingston Emergency Food Collaborative volunteer form, just in case. There's another question here, Paul.
Mhm.
Do you have recommendations? I believe this must be from a teacher. Do you have recommendations for reimagining the way we celebrate and learn about Dr. King in K-12 classrooms?
I haven't thought about that specifically, but I think that, just continuing to talk about what was really going on and what kind of things people were doing and what kind of things people are doing today are all factors that would go to making for more interesting lesson plans.
Okay, next, engaging the younger generation is something important that was brought up. What would you say directly to someone like me who is a current college student?
Don't get lost. Think about stuff and try to understand the society and use your education, get educated and use your education to further the struggle in whatever way you can so that you can become an educator on behalf of the future we all desire.
Southern Poverty Law Center, someone has noted, I'm sure everybody's following the chat, but I'll just say it out loud. Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance has Dr. King's materials, I believe.
And they have a lot of good materials. I have a problem with that title, Teaching Tolerance. I think we need to teach a lot more than tolerance. Tolerance is something you develop when you're in the presence of something you don't really like, but want to get along or something. So I think that, we need to teach love, respect, community, and so on. Tolerance is a low standard in my view.
I agree. I think, I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be respected.
Right, exactly.
I mean, perhaps in my personal friendships, but as a person within the United States, as a person in the global community, being tolerated, it's the shift in language though, and I see that shift in other ways. People have gone from talking about restorative justice to talking about transformative justice in a very short period of time. So obviously people are thinking about it and understanding it, but things like teaching tolerance, that's not going to change anytime soon, just like NAACP isn't going to change anytime soon. So, that word, but in any event, I'm going back into the chat just to make sure. Yes, teaching tolerance is a great tool despite its unfortunate title. And then someone else wrote, let SPLC know they need to change the name. I'm sure people have had that conversation with them. It is what it is. Any more thoughts, questions, comments? I think this has been very interesting. One more, but let me finish my thought or else I'll lose it. One thing I will reiterate is that I will, once this recording is up on YouTube, I will share it with everybody who registered for this. And also, given the back and forth in the chat, when it's recorded, we also get the chat transcript. So I will share that as well. So people will see what was said. Do you have any ideas about how the country can rebuild civil society so that we can decrease polarization and refamiliarize people with each other.
People got to talk. I mean, not just cut themselves off from other people, but, you know, talk to people about stuff, especially people you may disagree with. And if you're not afraid to face the larger issues, you'll find that the discussions are much more fruitful. It's when you're trying to fit everything into the liberal paradigm that it breaks down, because it doesn't really deal with the scale and scope of what the United States has done and been. So I just advise serious political discussions on a larger scale than we're used to doing, because we're used to talking to our friends and people we agree with. Unfortunately, I think study groups tend to contribute to that tendency.
What, to isolate people?
Yeah, you know, it's another silo thing, generally speaking. I'm not against all things in the silo. I don't think you can have a choir unless you preach to it. But I do think that you need to talk to people. I think that, you know, there'll be a greater degree of unity in the country if we're successful in bringing together all the oppressed people to make a fundamental change. That's the kind of unity I'd like to see, most of all. Having a bunch of unity about Joe Biden and his long history of congregating with racist politicians and his neoliberalism and so on, I don't think is necessarily a very good outcome. That's a kind of a low standard to shoot for.
One of the interesting things that has happened with me, and I've heard other people speak of and write about, is the fact that working in the virtual space, whether it's GoToMeeting, Google Meets, Zoom, whatever, people are reaching out to people that they might not even see because we don't even live near each other. And they're engaging with different people and having conversations, and they're meeting them out of necessity, but continuing to have conversations after that and establishing relationships. So I think a lot of us could do outreach. Well, when we're in the real world, it's kind of outreach right now is limited, but take advantage of the relationships that could be established as a result of virtual connections and virtual introductions.
That sounds right.
Any other questions? No. Well,
Everything's resolved.
well, yeah, I want peace in our time too. I don't think we accomplished it yet, but in any event, I want to, another one. One more. What is the international conversation? I'll leave that one to you, Paul.
That's a huge thing that I only have a trivial beginning understanding of. It's huge what's going on. There's a whole global movement towards what people are calling socialism for the 21st century, which is different than the socialism as it was practiced in the 20th century. And the biggest difference is the need to put more power directly into people's hands, not merely to have power in the hands of a party that claims it is representing or speaking on behalf of the people. It's not a simple thing to do. Venezuela is doing a lot of great stuff to try to figure out how to do that. Venezuela is an extraordinary place. There's just so much going on there. As near as I can tell, it's extremely exciting innovations they're doing. The United States has been trying to squeeze and kill that off because it's a dangerous brew that's being brewed there. So the international conversation is a huge thing. Venezuela I point to particularly, the one that's been going on a longer time, of course, is Cuba. There's a lot of very good examples of people getting themselves together to take control of their society. And it's worth looking into more and more. There's a guy named Michael Leibowitz, who is a theorist for the Venezuelan Revolution. He's written like 4 or 5 books. I've read some of his stuff, very interesting, very good stuff. And I don't remember his middle initial. It's Michael something Leibowitz. But there are other people, Marta Honecker. These are people that I've read a little bit of and have begun to know a little bit about. But it's a very rich and complicated discussion that's going on in other countries. And exactly what the lessons are for us are not clear, because many of these countries have actually been under US imperialist control. So the same government that we're working to transform is what has been oppressing these other countries around the world for a long time.
Thank you. This last comment is directed to us both. I wanted to thank both of you for taking your time to share your knowledge. And no, I just lost it. No, to share your knowledge and experience. This has been very informative and inspiring, and this will definitely stick with me.
Great.
Another one, yes, thank you, Paul and Troy Ellen, for this session. Thank you, Troy Ellen and Paul, for this event. We do need to keep his revolution moving.
Right.
I'm so pleased that all of you were able to join us today and spend a little time reimagining Dr. King and understanding what his true legacy is, and I think how we can continue to build upon it. Paul, thank you so much for this. Any
Thank you.
closing remarks?
Thank you, and thank everyone. I thank all of you. And I think Dr. King would have been very happy with a meeting like this.